Welcome to UBS Trending, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Anthony Pastore. As we get closer to the U.S. midterm elections in November, the results, or lack thereof, of state primaries are really coming into play. So based on what we're seeing, which party will be in control of the House and the Senate? We've got a lot more to get to today, coming out of the Beltway with my guest, Libby Cantrell from PIMCO. Libby, always nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thanks so much, Anthony.
There's a lot going on, Libby. There always is whenever we get together. It's like we always have personal catch-up, and then we have D.C. catch-up.
Yes.
But I want to start with the primaries, since more took place yesterday. And, of course, we had some big primaries in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, a lot that's coming out of that. But this is what I wanted to ask from you is, what is the overview of what we're seeing so far, and how will that really play into what we're going to see in November?
Yeah, so as you said, we had Georgia yesterday, we had Pennsylvania and North Carolina last week, and then we had Ohio, the Ohio primary in the beginning of May. Those are important for a variety of reasons, but the most important really is to take a temperature of how President Trump's endorsements have been doing. He's obviously been very vocal and weighed in on many of the candidates who are running for different positions. I think the kind of bottom line is he's had mixed success. Mm-hmm. Some folks he's endorsed have done very well, like J.D. Vance in Ohio. Other folks have not done as well. So that's sort of one big takeaway, is that President Trump has had sort of mixed success. The other is that incumbents are actually doing pretty well, and this was sort of underscored yesterday in Georgia in particular. Brian Kemp, the governor, was running for re-election. He sort of blew the socks off of Senator Perdue, who was running against him by almost 50 points, or more than 50 points. So incumbents are doing well as well. But there are many more primaries to be sort of looking out for: Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, New Hampshire. Those will be critical races in terms of determining which party controls the Senate, which will be, is a big open question at this point.
It seems like every time we get to a new midterm cycle, the actual primaries become more and more important. I don't remember talking about the primaries for midterms as much 8 years ago or 12 years ago, but really,
right.
It's such an important part of the process now as we look at the November midterms. But let me, from a policy perspective, there's a lot that's going on that we may not have time to get into today. But let me ask you, could something like overturning Roe v. Wade, which of course is something that we're all talking about, no matter what side you're on of this particular story, could it help Democrats? There's been some research showing that a majority of Americans want to keep Roe v. Wade the law of the land. How does that really work in your view?
Yeah, I think Americans usually prefer status quo for all intents and purposes, and particularly on this issue, that is the case. I think Democrats are hoping that it'll be able to help with turnout. What we now know is that enthusiasm for the midterms among Republicans is very high, as it tends to be when the party's not in power. For the party that is in power, Democrats in this case, enthusiasm has been quite low. So I think they are hoping that Roe v. Wade can galvanize some of those voters who might otherwise stay on the sidelines, particularly in states, interestingly enough, where the governors are up for re-election. I think because the federal rights might be in jeopardy now, who are elected at the state level, the governors,
That's
the
right.
state legislatures are even more important. And those races are in states like Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Georgia, which also happen to have Senate candidates on the ticket as well. So I think Democrats are hoping that this is a tailwind for them in sort of amidst many obstacles, honestly, going into the midterms.
Right, and Georgia there was a huge voter turnout in Georgia, which I think surprised a lot of folks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
On the Democratic side, I think that's
right.
the other thing and Pennsylvania as well. So exactly, that's exactly right. Some of these primaries where they were sort of thinking that this lackluster enthusiasm would translate to low Democratic turnout, it's actually been quite surprising.
Yeah.
On the Republican side, too. There's been very high turnout of Republicans, but that was, as you
right,
point out,
which was probably more expected
yeah, exactly.
than the Democrats. Yeah. There is a lot, certainly there's a lot at stake, and you can't discount the fact that social media, things like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, where people are getting a lot of information, sometimes misinformation, but information is making people really rally to their causes and show up at the polls. So maybe if that's what it takes to get people out, then so be it, right? But looking forward then, depending on what the outcomes are, what are the real policy implications after the midterms?
Yeah, so I think this is where we can't lose the forest for the trees.
That's
Some
right.
of us really like to talk about all the inside nitty-gritty in Washington, but from kind of a market's perspective, from an investor's perspective, honestly, if Democrats lose one chamber of Congress, and I think they will likely lose the House, to sort of put some numbers on it, historically, on average since the World War II, the party out of power has lost an average of 25 seats in the House, 4 seats in the Senate. So if past this prologue, which it likely will be, the House is probably lost for the Democrats.
And you could see that this time around.
And for sure,
Right.
the national mood is really dour. Biden's approval ratings have been suffering, and what have you. And then inflation, of course, gas and groceries are. The cost of those are both up. So the House is probably lost for Democrats. So even if Democrats somehow are able to retain the Senate, and I do think the Senate's much more of a toss-up for a variety of reasons, but even if they lose the House, which they likely will, then Biden's legislative agenda is basically stopped, maybe stalled, but probably stopped altogether. Progressive headline risk will likely decrease. Fiscal support, however, which has been driving the economy, support that's been provided under President Trump, under President Biden as it relates to COVID, and has really fueled economic growth over the last 2 years, that will also come to a stop. So if we're thinking about recession in 2023, I don't think we should be banking on a Congress, especially a divided one, stepping in and providing fiscal support. So bottom line here is, regardless of what happens with the Senate, if the House is lost, Biden's agenda is effectively stalled, and I think there'll be a real lack of fiscal support, even if we go into recession.
Right. Then we have 2 years of stalemate,
yes, and
pretty
gridlock.
much across the board. Right, and gridlock, which,
and debt ceiling fights, and
right.
government shutdown
and that's all coming
threats,
as well.
and that will all likely come. So
Right.
I think there's some positive for the markets, but there's also some negative as well.
Well, you mentioned inflation for a moment there. You can't really talk
Yeah.
about what's going on in any part of the world without thinking of that. But does the White House have the power to control inflation at all, or curb it, or make any, suggestions to the Federal Reserve?
Right,
Anything?
exactly.
Like, what do we have?
Yes. I think President Biden has been, very considered in terms of his language. He's really tried to say, well, the Fed is independent, but, while you're at it, try to bring inflation under control. Yeah, so, going back to even last year, I think inflation, it seemed clear that inflation was likely a political problem, if not an economic problem. Now it's both a political problem and an economic problem, as inflation has just proved a lot more persistent as these supply chain issues have continued, as demand from all this fiscal stimulus has continued, and what have you.
We see gas prices
For
continuing
lots
to
of
rise.
varieties, and then
everything.
of course the invasion of Ukraine by
That's right.
Russia, which sort of just put a punctuation, an exclamation point, I should say, on all of this. So I think the White House knows inflation's an issue. So what can they do? I think the bottom line is very little. They've tried to sort of put downward pressure on gas prices by increasing the gas from the oil, from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
That's right.
That was pretty dramatic. Honestly, that's probably the most dramatic thing that they can do. There's been talk about a gas tax holiday,
right.
about tariff roll-offs. I don't think any of those things actually are going to happen. I don't think tariffs are going to be rolled off. I think politically it's just too difficult.
And think about the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. It's great that you can release more, but it's just oil. It still needs to then get refined.
Exactly.
So we can put it into our cars and homes.
It kind of helps with the forward curve, if you will, but doesn't
right.
really do anything in the immediate.
Right.
In the immediate.
Do you think Biden would execute some executive orders and things like that to get, so back to what you were saying before, if they do retain, the Democrats do retain the Senate but lose the House, could he step in and say, well, you know what, executive order number, whatever is going to happen right now?
Yeah, and so I do think that you will see kind of the shift to sort of the regulatory arm of the government. However, we just should keep in mind that with executive orders, they still need to be done within the confines of existing law. Mm-hmm. So short of Congress changing the law, Biden's kind of wiggle room is relatively limited. He really just can't do very much from a policy perspective without Congress.
So let me ask you before we wrap up, Libby, as far as legislation goes, outside of the midterms, what are you expecting for the rest of the year? There's so much that's being discussed coming out of D.C. Yeah. What are you looking to see?
Yeah, so I would say with a very high conviction, we're going to see something called the Bipartisan Innovation and Competition Act. The reason this is important, Anthony, is this is the closest to industrial policy that the United States really has had for decades. This is an anti-kind of China competition bill. This increases funding for semiconductors and manufacturing here in the United States. It also increases money for scientific and technological research. So as Americans, we should feel good about this bill. It will pass on a bipartisan basis and be signed into law probably by end of June or July. So that is with high conviction. I am in the minority, the vast minority at this point, that still thinks that something on the Build Back Better agenda can be passed, particularly some of the climate provisions, drug pricing, and then maybe very incremental tax increases. But the window is
yeah, I was going to say, this bill's been...
And I'm in the vast minority, so I could be spectacularly wrong or spectacularly right.
Either way, we want you to come back and talk about it.
Because that bill... Remind me if I'm right, but not if I'm wrong.
Because that bill has been floating around for months and months.
It's crazy, yeah. And this is where I do think President Biden has suffered in that he sort of overestimated, overinterpreted his mandate, sort of went, interestingly, ran more as a center left, governed more as a progressive, left, and as a result has not been able to get as much done as I think people really, were hoping that he would be able to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, everybody's got a job ahead of themselves, and so do you, I know. So we so appreciate you making time. Please come back.
I will. Thank
Love
you so
having you on.
Love the studio.
Thank you. First time here, so
exciting.
Hopefully we'll get you in a few more times. There's a lot to talk about over the course of the next few months, Libby. Thanks. Always good to see you.
Thanks so much.
Great. Libby Cantrell from PIMCO. And for more information from UBS and our partners like PIMCO, you can visit our website at ubs.com/views and make sure to follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Plus, you can check out all of our past UBS Trending episodes on demand. And if you have any questions about how this conversation or any of the others we have here in this studio affect your portfolio, talk with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. We hope you have a great day. And remember to keep your eyes on what's trending and go vote. See you soon.